Jake Morrison pushed his mop across the gleaming obsidian floor of the Valyrian Grand Council chamber. The black surface reflected everything like a mirror, showing the towering crystalline figures above him as they argued. 3 years he'd been doing this. 3 years of being invisible. The Valorians were beautiful in a way that made humans feel small. They stood 12 feet tall, their bodies made of living crystal that pulsed with colors depending on their mood. Right now, the council chamber was filled with angry reds and anxious oranges. They were scared, even if they'd never admit it. Jake dipped his mop in the bucket and kept working. The trick was to move slowly, methodically, like you weren't really there at all. That's what they expected from humans. Ever since Earth got absorbed into their empire 30 years ago, humans had become the workforce nobody noticed. Janitors, cooks, maintenance workers. The jobs that kept everything running but that nobody wanted to think about. Above him, King Valeric stood at the head of the massive council table. His crystalline body flickered between deep blue and that worried orange. Jake had learned to read their colors over the years. Blue meant thinking deeply. Orange meant stress. Red meant anger. Right now, the king was cycling between all three. 3 territories, one of the council members was saying, his voice booming through the chamber. 3 entire sectors threatening to break away from the empire. We cannot allow this defiance to stand. Jake squeezed out his mop and moved to another section of floor. He'd learned their language without meaning to. When you spend 40 hours a week in the same room, listening to the same voices, eventually the sounds start making sense. The Valorians had no idea he understood every word. Why would they? To them, he was just furniture that moved. Military intervention is the only solution, another council member declared, slamming what passed for a hand on the table. The crystal made a ringing sound. We crush the rebellion in Sector Draxis first. Make an example. The others will fall in line. The king's colors dimmed. That was sadness, Jake had learned. Or maybe exhaustion. And if they don't fall in line? The king asked quietly. If they fight? We're talking about billions of lives. Then billions of lives learn what happens when you defy the Valyrian Empire, the council member shot back. Your Majesty, forgive me, but this is not complicated. Power must be maintained. Order must be preserved. 3,000 years of civilization doesn't continue by showing weakness. Jake moved his mop in slow circles. He thought about his daughter, Lisa, studying at one of their universities halfway across the galaxy. He'd taken this job so she could have that chance. On Earth, humans got basic education. But if you wanted real opportunities, if you wanted to actually make something of yourself, you needed to enter Valyrian society. That meant Valyrian schools. And Valyrian schools cost money that a history professor's salary couldn't cover. So Jake Morrison, who used to teach about the rise and fall of empires to college students, now mopped floors in the heart of the greatest empire the galaxy had ever seen. Funny how life worked. The council argued for another hour. Jake had finished half the floor by the time they finally left, still arguing as they walked out. Their crystalline bodies cast rainbow reflections across every surface as they passed. None of them looked at him. Not once. But the king stayed. King Valerix walked to the massive window that overlooked the capital city. Thousands of spires reached toward the purple sky, each one pulsing with light. Millions of beings down there. Billions across the empire. All counting on him to keep everything together. Jake knew he should leave. His shift was technically over. But something made him stay. Maybe it was the way the king's colors had gone dim, like a light slowly dying. Maybe it was because Jake recognized that particular kind of tired. He'd felt it himself, back on Earth, watching his world become just another territory in someone else's empire. He picked up his bucket and started walking toward the door. The sound of water sloshing seemed too loud in the quiet chamber. Human. Jake froze. In 3 years, the king had never spoken to him. Never even looked at him. He turned slowly. Yes, Your Majesty? The king didn't turn from the window. How long have you served in these halls? 3 years, Your Majesty. 3 years. The king's voice was soft, almost talking to himself. 3 years you've cleaned these floors while we debated war and peace. While we discussed the fate of billions. He finally turned, and his facete eyes fixed on Jake. You understand our language? It wasn't a question. Jake's heart hammered, but he kept his face neutral. Yes, Your Majesty. Then you heard what we discussed tonight. You heard them call for war. The king moved closer, and Jake had to tilt his head back to look up at him. Tell me something, human. Your species, you had empires once, didn't you? before we arrived. Jake nodded carefully. Many of them, Your Majesty. And? The king's colors flickered with something Jake couldn't quite read. Did any of them last? Did any of them figure out how to hold territory without constant force? It was the strangest moment of Jake's life. A king who ruled 1,000 worlds, asking a janitor for advice. He could have said nothing. Should have said nothing. But something in those flickering colors, that exhausted dimness, made him answer honestly. The ones that lasted, Your Majesty, Jake said quietly, learned that the harder you squeeze, the more violently things break. They learned to hold loosely. The king stared at him for a long moment. Then, without another word, he walked out of the chamber. Jake stood there with his mop and bucket, wondering if he just made the biggest mistake of his life, or if something important had just begun. Jake didn't see the king for 2 weeks after that night. He went back to his routine like nothing had happened. Wake up at 4 in the morning. Take the transit pod to the chromatic spire. Clock in. Clean the council chambers, the hallways, the administrative offices. Clock out. Go home to his tiny apartment in the human quarter. But things were getting worse out there. He could feel it in the air. The news feed showed protests in Sector Draxis. Ships were being repositioned. The Valerian military was flexing its muscles, getting ready for something big. Jake watched it all and thought about empires he used to teach his students about. The Romans. The British. The Mongols. All of them faced this exact moment, where you either adapted or started the long, bloody slide into collapse. One night, Jake was cleaning the king's private study. It was a smaller room than the council chamber, filled with books and data crystals from 1,000 different worlds. The king usually wasn't there during cleaning hours, but that night, when Jake pushed his cart through the door, there he was. King Valeric sat at his desk, surrounded by holographic displays showing troop movements and territory maps. His colors were cycling through worried oranges and dark blues so fast it made Jake's eyes hurt. Your Majesty, Jake said, starting to back out. I'm sorry, I can come back later. No. The king's voice stopped him. Stay. Clean. I want to ask you something. Jake's stomach tightened, but he nodded and started dusting the shelves. He could feel the king's eyes on him. That thing you said, the king began. About holding loosely. What did you mean? Jake paused, cloth in hand. This was dangerous territory. But the king had asked, and something told him that honesty was the only thing that would work here. Back on Earth, Jake said slowly, we had this empire. The British. At their peak, they controlled about a quarter of the world's land and people. Massive, right? But they tried to control everything with force. They took resources, imposed their laws, treated everyone else like children who needed to be civilized. The king's colors shifted to a focused purple. He was listening. And, he prompted. And it fell apart, Jake said. Not because they weren't strong enough. Because people don't want to be ruled like that. The tighter Britain held on, the more violently their colonies fought back. India, America, dozens of others. Each rebellion made them hold on tighter, which made the next rebellion worse. Jake moved to another shelf, keeping his hands busy. It made it easier to talk. But we had other examples too. Systems that worked better. The United States started as 13 separate colonies that joined together. They kept their local governments, their own laws about local stuff. But they worked together for defense, for trade, for the big things that affected everyone. It wasn't perfect, but it lasted because people chose to stay. The king stood and walked to the window. The city lights painted his crystalline body in 1,000 colors. My advisors say that's weakness, he said quietly. They say if I give the territories autonomy, every sector will demand the same. The empire will fragment. Everything my ancestors built will crumble. Jake took a breath. This was the moment. He could stay safe, agree with the council, keep his head down. Or he could say what he really thought. Your Majesty, with respect, I think your advisors are asking the wrong question. The king turned, colors flashing with surprise. Nobody told him his advisors were wrong. Jake pressed on. They're asking how to keep control. But the real question is, why do you want control? What's the point of an empire? To bring order, the king said automatically. To bring civilization to chaos. To protect and guide the lesser species. Jake almost smiled at that. Lesser species. That's what the Valorians called everyone else. Okay, but does it work? Jake asked. Are those outer territories more orderly because you're forcing them to obey? Or are they in chaos because they are fighting against you? The king's colors went still. that deep, thinking blue. An empire held by force, Jake continued, needs constant force to maintain. You crush one rebellion, another pops up. You station troops everywhere, which costs resources, which means you need to extract more from the territories, which makes them hate you more. It's a cycle that doesn't end well. I've seen it play out a dozen times in Earth's history. So what's the alternative? The king's voice had an edge now. I just let them go? Let the empire dissolve? No, Jake said firmly. You evolve it. You turn it into something people want to be part of. Give them real autonomy over their local affairs. Let them keep their cultures, their traditions. But maintain the bigger structure for mutual defense, for trade, for the things everyone benefits from. The king was quiet for a long time. Jake went back to cleaning, giving him space to think. The Romans did something like that, Jake said after a while. They let conquered territories keep their local governments and religions as long as they paid taxes and didn't rebel. It worked for centuries. Not perfectly, but better than most. But Rome fell, the king pointed out. Yeah, it did. But not because of that system. Rome fell because it got too big to defend, too corrupt to govern, and too confident to adapt when things changed. The empire that lasted longest was actually the eastern half, the Byzantines. They survived another 1,000 years because they were more flexible, more willing to change with the times. The king turned fully to face Jake now. You're saying I need to change or die? I'm saying empires that can't adapt become history lessons, Jake said. And civilizations that do adapt become legends. The silence stretched between them. Finally, the king's colors settled into a determined white. Tell me exactly how you would handle the Sector Draxus situation, he said. And so Jake did. They talked for 3 hours that night. A king and a janitor, discussing the fate of billions. Jake explained federalism, autonomy, the difference between independence and self-governance. He talked about how to make people feel respected instead of conquered. How to turn subjects into partners. When Jake finally left that night, he knew everything had changed. The king had decided to try it. One sector, one chance. They'd offer Sector Thalys, the smallest rebel territory, a charter of autonomy. Local self-governance with continued membership in the larger federation. Jake walked home through the quiet streets thinking about his old students back on Earth. They'd never believed their professor was now advising an alien king. He thought about his daughter Lisa, studying engineering at the Valeian Academy, building a future none of them could have imagined. And he thought about what came next. Because he knew the council wouldn't like this. Not one bit. He was right about that. The announcement came 3 days later. King Valeric stood before the Grand Council and declared the Valerian Reformation. Sector Thalys would receive a charter of autonomy. They'd govern their own local affairs while remaining part of the greater Valerian structure. It was, the king said, an evolution of empire into something greater. The council chamber exploded in angry reds and oranges. Jake watched it all from the corner where he was emptying waste bins. His hands moved on autopilot, but his mind was racing. This was bad. The council members weren't just disagreeing with the king. They looked like they wanted to overthrow him. Governor Thane, the largest and most powerful of the council members, stood up. His crystalline body blazed with furious red light. This is madness, Thane declared. 3,000 years of Valerian supremacy, and you want to throw it away based on what? The whispers of lesser species? The advice of primitives? The king's colors stayed calm, steady white. I am not throwing anything away. I am ensuring our civilization continues to thrive. By showing weakness. Another council member joined in. Every sector will demand the same treatment. We'll have 1,000 different governments, all pulling in different directions. This is how empires die, Your Majesty. The debate raged for hours. Jake kept working, kept moving, but he felt eyes on him now. Council members glancing his way. Whispering. They knew. Somehow they knew the king had been talking to him. After the session ended, Jake headed for the service elevator. He just wanted to go home, check in with Lisa, and pretend none of this was happening. He never made it to the elevator. 2 royal guards, each 8 feet tall and armored in flowing crystal plates, stepped into his path. Their faces were unreadable, their colors a neutral gray. Jake Morrison, one of them said. You're under arrest by order of Governor Thane. The charge is sedition against the Valerian Empire. Jake's blood went cold. There must be some mistake. No mistake, human. Come with us. They took him to a holding cell deep in the spire. Not the regular detention area where drunk humans or petty criminals went. This was something else. High security. The kind of place people disappeared into. Jake sat on the metal bench in his cell and tried not to panic. He thought about Lisa. Who would tell her? Who would keep paying for her schooling? His mind spun in circles until he felt sick. 3 days passed. No one spoke to him. Food appeared twice a day through a slot. The lights never turned off completely. Jake lost track of time, of what day it was, of everything except the growing certainty that he'd made a terrible mistake. He should have kept his mouth shut. Should have stayed invisible like he was supposed to. On the 4th day, they came for him. The Grand Council chamber looked different when you were standing in the middle of it in chains. Jake had always seen it from the edges, from the corners. Now he stood at the center, under the massive domed ceiling, with the entire council arranged in a circle around him. Governor Thane stood as prosecutor. His voice boomed through the chamber. Members of the council, we are here to address a corruption that has infected the highest levels of our government. This human, Jake Morrison, stands accused of manipulating our king. Of planting dangerous ideas. Of undermining 3 millennia of Valyrian civilization. Jake's wrists hurt where the energy restraints held them. He looked up at the king, sitting on his raised platform. Valerix's colors were carefully neutral. He couldn't help Jake. Not without confirming everything Thane was saying. The evidence is clear, Thane continued. This human, a mere janitor, has been meeting privately with King Valerix. Feeding him primitive ideas about governance. Ideas that contradict everything our empire stands for. And now, coincidentally, our king proposes reforms that weaken our control and embolden rebels. Another council member spoke up. His daughter attends our most prestigious university. Clearly this was planned. The human gains access through menial work, uses his daughter as leverage or cover, and slowly poisons the king's mind with human philosophies. Jake wanted to laugh at how wrong they were, but fear kept him silent. They were building a story, and the truth didn't matter. They needed someone to blame for the king's change of heart, and a human janitor was perfect. What do you have to say for yourself? Thane demanded, moving closer. His massive form cast shadows across Jake's small frame. Jake looked up at him. At all of them. These beings who ruled 1,000 worlds, who lived for centuries, who thought they had all the answers. And something in him snapped. Not into anger, but into clarity. I'm a janitor, Jake said, his voice steady. I clean your floors. I empty your trash. For 3 years, I've been invisible to all of you. And yeah, the king asked me questions. He asked what I knew about empires and how they survive. So I told him. You had no right, Thane started, but Jake kept talking. I told him about Earth's history. About empires that fell because they couldn't adapt. About systems that worked because they respected the people in them. That's not manipulation. That's just history. Facts. Things that happened. Human arrogance, Thane spat. You think your primitive world's petty squabbles compare to the Valyrian Empire? I think patterns repeat, Jake said. I think power is power, whether it's on Earth or across 1,000 star systems. And I think the king asked me because maybe, just maybe, he wanted to hear something other than what you all keep telling him. The chamber erupted in angry colors and shouting. Jake stood in the middle of it all, still speaking even though he could barely hear himself. If listening to people beneath you is weakness, then maybe that's exactly why empires fall. Maybe that's why rebellions happen. Because you stop hearing anything except your own voices telling you how great you are. Enough. Thane's roar silenced everyone. You dare lecture us? You, who come from a conquered world? Whose entire species serves at our pleasure? Yeah, I do, Jake said quietly. Because someone should. The silence that followed was absolute. Jake realized he just guaranteed whatever punishment they had planned. But he also realized he didn't care. He was tired of being invisible. Tired of watching powerful people make the same stupid mistakes humans had made 100 times before. King Valerix finally stood. His colors blazed white, so bright it hurt to look at. This human did not corrupt me, the king's voice rang out. He reminded me of something we Valorians forgot in our certainty. Wisdom doesn't only come from the powerful. It doesn't only exist in those who rule. Sometimes the clearest view of a problem comes from those who stand outside it. Your Majesty, Thane began. I invoke Crown's prerogative, the king declared. The charges are dismissed. This human is free. The chamber exploded again, but the king's word was final. The restraints fell away from Jake's wrists. He stood there, stunned, as guards escorted him out. But as he left, he heard Thane's final words, carried on the chamber's perfect acoustics. "Then you've sealed your own fate, Valerix. And his." Jake knew then that this wasn't over. It was just beginning. And the price for speaking truth to power might be higher than either of them had imagined. The trial changed everything. Jake was free, but the damage was done. Sector Thalos had accepted the Charter of Autonomy, but the other two rebel territories saw the whole mess as proof that the Valyrian Empire was eating itself from the inside. Within a week, Sectors Draxus and Corvin declared complete independence. Not autonomy. Independence. They seized 3 military installations and formed their own alliance. The Valyrian fleet mobilized. War was coming, and everyone knew it. Jake went back to work, but it felt surreal. He mopped the same floors, emptied the same bins, but now council members stared at him as he passed. Some with hatred. Some with curiosity. None with the comfortable invisibility he'd hidden behind for 3 years. His daughter Lisa called him every day, terrified. "Dad, they're saying humans helped start a war. Students are looking at me differently. Should I come home?" "No," Jake told her firmly. "You stay there. You finish your education. This will blow over." He didn't believe that, but what else could he say? The council met in emergency session for 3 days straight. Jake wasn't supposed to be there, but he was still the janitor. Floors still needed cleaning. So he worked and listened as they debated. Governor Thane had the votes. The military option had won. The Valyrian fleet would strike Sector Draxus first, the more militant of the two territories. Overwhelming force. Quick victory. Make an example that would echo across the empire. King Valerix fought against it, but he was being overruled. Jake watched the king's colors dim day by day, watched him age in ways that crystalline beings shouldn't age. On the third night, long after the council had left, Jake found the king alone in his study again. The holographic displays showed fleet positions, attack plans, casualty projections. The numbers were horrifying. "They're going to do it," the king said without looking up. "I can delay them maybe a week, but not stop them. And once it starts..." He trailed off. Jake set down his cleaning supplies. "You gave them autonomy, but you didn't give them a voice." The king finally looked at him. "What?" "The charter," Jake explained. "It was generous, don't get me wrong. But it was still a gift from above. You granted them privileges. You didn't ask them what they needed. You didn't negotiate with them as equals. They still saw themselves as subjects being given permission to exist. They're part of my empire. That's the reality." "Then change the reality," Jake said. "Change what the empire is." The king's colors flickered with frustration. "How?" "They've declared independence. They've taken our military bases. They won't even answer diplomatic messages." Jake pulled up a chair without being asked. At this point, formality seemed pointless. "Then don't send messages. Go there." "What?" "Go to them. Yourself. Not with a fleet. Not with guards and advisors and all the trappings of power. Just go and talk to them like they're people you need to negotiate with, not subjects you need to control." The king stared at him like he'd suggested flying into a star. "That's insane. They'd take me hostage. Or kill me. At minimum, they'd humiliate me and use it as propaganda." "Maybe," Jake admitted. "Or maybe they'd respect you for it. Maybe they'd actually listen because you're showing them something they've never seen before. A Valyrian king treating them as equals." "The council would never allow it." "Since when do you need permission?" Jake asked. "You're the king. Use that crown's prerogative you used to save me. Go before they can stop you." The king paced to the window, his massive form reflecting in the glass. "And if it fails? If they do take me hostage or worse? Then at least you tried something different than the same cycle of force and rebellion that every empire in history has fallen into," Jake said. "And maybe, just maybe, someone will remember that a king once had the courage to try." The silence stretched long enough that Jake thought the conversation was over. Then the king turned, colors shifting to that determined white. "I'll need someone with me. Someone who understands how to talk to people who've been treated as lesser. Someone who knows what it's like to be on the other side of empire." Jake's stomach dropped. "Your Majesty, I'm not a diplomat. I'm a janitor who used to teach history." "Exactly. You're not part of the system they hate. You're human. Your people were absorbed into this empire just like theirs. You understand what they feel. They might kill us both." "Yes," the king agreed simply. But doing nothing guarantees millions will die. This at least gives us a chance. Jake thought about Lisa, about his little apartment, about the safe, invisible life he'd built. Then he thought about all those casualty projections. About entire worlds burning because nobody would try something different. When do we leave? He asked. They planned it in secret. Just the two of them and a pilot the king absolutely trusted. A small diplomatic vessel, unmarked, carrying minimal supplies. They'd go to Draxis first, the harder of the two territories. If they could reach an agreement there, Corvin would likely follow. The night before they left, Jake recorded a message for Lisa. Just in case. He told her he loved her. Told her to finish her degree no matter what happened. Told her to be proud of who she was, human or otherwise. Then he deleted it. If things went wrong, the last thing she needed was a goodbye message to haunt her. The morning of departure, they slipped out of the spire before dawn. No ceremony, no announcement. They'd be halfway to Draxis before the council even realized the king was gone. As their small ship lifted off, Jake looked back at the glowing spires of the capital. It was beautiful in a way that still took his breath away, even after 3 years. All that civilization, all that power, all that confidence. And it was all balanced on a knife's edge, about to tip into war. The king sat across from him in the cramped passenger compartment. You know they'll probably kill me for this. The council, I mean. Even if we survive Draxis, Thane and his allies will see this as the ultimate weakness. Yeah, probably, Jake agreed. And you? They'll definitely kill you. A human involved in high-level diplomatic negotiations? Breaking every protocol? Thane will have you executed before we even land back home. I figured. The king's colors shifted to something Jake hadn't seen before. A soft, warm gold. If he had to guess, he'd say it was gratitude. Why are you doing this? The king asked. You could have stayed invisible. Kept your head down. Raised your daughter in peace. Jake thought about that. About all the lectures he'd given to students who'd never listened. About all the empires he'd studied that made the same mistakes over and over. About the chance, however small, to actually change something instead of just teaching about it. Because someone has to, he said finally. And because maybe your empire doesn't have to end the way all the others did. Maybe this time, someone learns. The ship jumped to faster-than-light travel, and the capital disappeared behind them. Ahead lay Sector Draxis, armed and angry and waiting. Two beings heading into the unknown, hoping that courage and honesty might somehow be enough. Jake closed his eyes and tried not to think about all the ways this could go horribly wrong. The journey to Draxis took 4 days. 4 days of sitting in a cramped ship, wondering if they were flying toward a negotiation or an execution. Jake spent most of it reading everything he could about the Draxis people. Their history, their culture, what they'd been like before the Valorians absorbed them 200 years ago. They'd been explorers once. Traders. A society built on exchange and mutual benefit. Then the Valorians came and turned them into administrators and logistics officers. Useful, but never respected. Never equal. The king spent the time practicing what he'd say. Jake listened to draft after draft, shaking his head at each one. You sound like you're granting them a favor, Jake said after the 5th attempt. Like you're still the benevolent ruler bestowing gifts on grateful subjects. But I am the ruler, the king said, frustrated. Not if you want this to work. For the next few days, you're just another being who wants to find a solution. Check your ego at the door, your majesty. The king's colors flashed with irritation, but he didn't argue. He was learning. When they finally dropped out of faster-than-light near Draxis, alarms immediately blared. 3 warships surrounded them within minutes, weapons locked. Unidentified vessel, power down and prepare to be boarded. A voice crackled over the comm. Any aggressive action will be met with immediate destruction. The pilot looked to the king. Valerix took a deep breath, his colors settling into calm blue. This is King Valerix of the Valerian Empire. I'm here to talk. Nothing more. The silence on the other end lasted so long Jake thought they'd been cut off. Then, you're lying. This is a trick. No trick, the king said. I'm in a small diplomatic vessel with 1 pilot and 1 advisor. You can scan us. You'll see we're unarmed, unshielded. I came to negotiate. Another long pause. Stand by. 2 hours later, they were escorted to the surface under heavy guard. The Draxis capital wasn't like the gleaming spires of Nexus Prime. It was older, more practical. Buildings that prioritized function over beauty. It reminded Jake of industrial cities back on Earth. They were taken to what had once been the Valyrian governor's mansion. Now it served as the provisional government headquarters. The Draxis leaders waited in what used to be a formal reception hall. 12 of them, representing different regions and factions. Their skin had a metallic sheen, and they moved with an efficiency that spoke to their trading heritage. At the head of the group stood Chancellor Dren. She was smaller than the others, but her presence filled the room. Her eyes locked onto the king with undisguised hatred. "Give me one reason," she said without preamble, "why I shouldn't have you executed right now. Your empire has exploited us for 2 centuries. You've taken our resources, suppressed our culture, treated us like servants in our own system. And now you come here, to our world, and expect what? Mercy?" The king started to speak, but Jake touched his arm. They discussed this. The king needed to listen first, talk second. "You have every right to be angry," the king said, and Jake heard real humility in his voice. "Everything you said is true. My empire has treated you as subjects, not as partners. As resources to be managed, not as a civilization to be respected. And yet you expect us to remain part of it." Dren's voice dripped with scorn. "No," the king said, and that surprised everyone in the room, including Jake. "I expect nothing. I came to ask what you need. Not to tell you what I'll give you. To ask what would make you want to be part of a reformed Valyrian structure." The Draxis leaders exchanged glances. This wasn't what they'd expected. "There is nothing you could offer," one of the other leaders said. "We want independence. We want to govern ourselves without your interference." "Okay," Jake spoke up for the first time. "Let's talk about that. What does independence mean to you specifically? What does it look like in practical terms?" They talked for 6 hours that first day. Jake kept steering the conversation away from abstract principles and toward concrete needs. What did they want to control? Trade? Defense? Education? Resource allocation? What did they need from the larger galactic community? Slowly, a picture emerged. They didn't hate the idea of being part of something bigger. They hated being treated as less than. They hated having no voice in decisions that affected their lives. They hated being told their culture and history didn't matter. "So don't make them subjects," Jake said during a break, speaking quietly to the king. "Make them partners. Equal partners in building something new." The negotiations lasted 3 more days. There were moments when it nearly fell apart. Moments when old grievances bubbled up and threatened to derail everything. But the king kept listening. Kept asking questions instead of making demands. And Jake kept reminding everyone that they were trying to build something that had never existed before. In the end, they drafted what they called the Federation Treaty. Not a charter granted from above, but a mutual agreement between equals. Draxis and Corvin would have complete autonomy over internal affairs. They'd have equal representation in a reformed galactic council. They'd keep their resources and trade networks. But they'd remain part of the larger Federation for mutual defense, for coordinated scientific research, for the benefits that came from being part of something bigger than themselves. Most importantly, the treaty acknowledged past wrongs. The king, on behalf of the Valyrian Empire, formally apologized for 2 centuries of exploitation and cultural suppression. It was just words, but words mattered. When they finally left Draxis, Jake felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. They still had to go to Corvin, but Chancellor Dren had already sent word ahead. Corvin's leaders were willing to talk. "We did it," the king said as their ship lifted off. His colors were bright, almost joyful. "We started it," Jake corrected. "Now comes the hard part. Convincing your council to accept this." The king's colors dimmed a bit. "Yes. That." They returned to Nexus Prime to find the capital in chaos. The council had discovered the king's absence 3 days into the trip. Governor Thane had tried to declare a regency, but enough moderate council members blocked him. The empire had been on the brink of civil war. When the king presented the Federation Treaty to the council, the chamber erupted. Thane called it surrender. Betrayal. The end of everything the Valorians had built. But others saw it differently. Younger council members, those who'd watched the military mobilization with growing horror, saw it as a path forward. A way to maintain the structure and benefits of the empire while evolving past its oppressive aspects. The debate lasted for 2 weeks. Jake wasn't allowed in the council sessions, but he heard about them from the king. It came down to a single vote. The Federation Treaty passed by 1 vote. The Valyrian Empire became the Valyrian Federation. It was messy, uncertain, and controversial. Other territories immediately demanded similar treaties. Some council members resigned in protest. The military had to be restructured. Everything changed. Jake went back to his janitorial work. The king offered him a position as Commons advisor, a new council seat representing those traditionally excluded from power. Jake turned it down. He recommended others for the role, beings from different species and backgrounds who understood what it meant to be invisible. Months passed. The Federation held, though barely. There were setbacks and challenges. But there were also successes. Sectors that had been restless began to engage with the new system. Innovation increased when local cultures were allowed to flourish. One evening, Jake was mopping the council chamber when King Valerix came in. The king nodded to him, a simple gesture of acknowledgement. Jake nodded back and kept mopping. They didn't need words. They both knew what they'd done. They'd taken the chance that power was terrified to take. They'd listened instead of commanded. They'd admitted mistakes instead of defending them. They'd chosen evolution over stagnation. Jake's communicator buzzed. A message from Lisa. She graduated top of her engineering class. A Valerian firm wanted to hire her, not because she was human and cheap labor, but because she was brilliant. Jake smiled and went back to his work. The floor still needed cleaning. The bins still needed emptying. But now, when he worked in silence, he worked in a civilization that was learning to see everyone, even janitors. Sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was speak truth when asked, then return to humility. Real change happens slowly, one conversation at a time, one act of respect at a time. And sometimes, just sometimes, the invisible people changed everything.